The 1991 film Naked Lunch by director David Cronenberg and based loosely on the book of the same name by William S. Burroughs is one of my favorite films to watch. It's one that I have a lot of time for. I enjoy quite a lot. I find it's quite rewarding to revisit and is just an enjoyable experience. And it's one that I think is a great example from which to make a key point about the nature of adaptation between mediums. But I will get that in a minute. So as a film, when I say I enjoy it, it's one of my favorites, I think it's one of the best, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a pleasant viewing experience at all times or it's enjoyable at all times. There's some quite disturbing material in it and some difficult scenes to get through. But as a piece of art, as artistic expression and creativity enlivened, I find it to be fantastically expressive. It's very vivid visuals and ideas, very exciting in that sense and thought-provoking. I like the fact that it's very abstract and that it's laden with a lot of ideas, but not concretized or crystallized to the extent that you have to just see them in a black and white manner. It's very much got quite a deep palette from which it's got quite an open-ended nature to it that kind of allows a lot to be inferred or interpreted from it that may not necessarily be even the artist's initial intention, which is something I actually love about art and as a general quality in art, because I mean I could do a whole video on this topic, couldn't I? It's just I think that actually art, the value of it should exist between the artist and the person observing it, the observer, or the one interpreting it. I don't think that actually all interpretations of art should come from what was intended by the artist. So actually, in terms of art, I have a very different philosophy than I do in terms of speech and communication, because that is trying to communicate and transmit certain ideas, and it's not just about what you interpret. I have almost a 180 perspective when it comes to art in that sense. So I think this is a great piece in as much as I take different things from it or infer different things than probably other people would. I mean, there's a lot of very abstract things in it that are very interesting and certainly very thought-provoking, like whenever typewriters appear as a theme or a motif in it, they at times represent drugs or means of expressing certain ideas in his life. The idea of interzone itself as a place, but it's also a state of mind. And is this part of when he's in the drug world? Is this just his creativity? Is this his ideas that are just then interpreted through the drug world that we see? I mean, none of this is certain. None of these answers are given because there are no answers. It's not even really any questions. We're just seeing things. And then from these, we fix together some sort of a pattern and we enjoy the process, the journey of doing so, presumably. And then also, if you're a creative person, also the idea of like writing to get rid of these ideas or to fulfill a certain task that feels like it's beyond you, even though to the people outside you, it's all coming from you and they just imagine it as imagination, which obviously, I mean, imagination can literally be the most dangerous thing in the entire world. As anyone like a Stalin will tell you, that's why they kill people over ideas and certain notions and expressing certain ideas more so than even very simple crimes, which everyone can see as problems of society. Also in the sense that your own minds, your own madnesses, your own things that haunt you, memories, ideas, all come from the realm of the imagination. They're not just things that are external. It's very rare that they're as damaging as an idea can be if it goes the wrong way or it happens to be negative or destructive in the way it plays out within the realm of your mind. So one of the problems I have with this film is people will, I mean, this has already happened. The film came out in 1991. Write this off as, oh, it's just a bunch of random stuff that happens to a guy who's taking drugs, and so he's just hallucinating things. To me, that misses any kind of a point that I take from the movie. Like, sure, yes, there's a lot of hallucination involved in it, and that's an excuse to show off things in an abstract or a surrealistic manner and to show us and to kind of play with the medium, the visual medium of film and special effects to show us incredible things and representations and metaphors that otherwise would just be an idea or would be the way he was interpreting something that we wouldn't see if we were a real person stood next to him in the room. We wouldn't see these things going crazy. We're getting to see sort of from his perspective, but not out of his eyes. So yes, this is a fantastic excuse to enjoy the dance of art, the observer and the observed, and to create something special there, which in my opinion is one of the great things about cinema, about films. So sure, there's a lot of hallucination involved there, but again, kind of touching on what I said about imagination, people right often downplay hallucination in our culture, in Western culture, in such a ridiculous fashion, because it is literally one of the most important concepts and areas of the human mind imaginable. I mean, it's not like hallucination is just where you take a drug or you get into a certain state and behind your eyes you just see sort of like funny colors, and then some of them maybe look a bit like a cat moving across your eyes. Now, if that were the case, then you wouldn't see all this fantastic art being produced from people who are getting into these states or taking things back from these states or having ideas molded and shaped by being within these states of consciousness. No, instead, you're getting incredibly detailed, complex, abstract, yet meaningful and significant experiences, ideas, thoughts, tweaks, paradigm-breaking epiphanies coming from these states. That's a lot more than just hallucination or, oh, it's all in your head and you're making up. Yeah, everything tangible and meaningful in the history of humanity pretty much has been within our heads and downloaded into the world as everything you see around you. That is an invention and is not just a natural part of the world. So one of the things I love about this movie is the notion that your subconscious, and the experiences and thoughts that are going on, the same way as in a hallucination, can have incredible impact, and you can interpret and model things and find meaning within them and even create perhaps meaning or some sort of interpretation out of a milieu of otherwise confusing patterns and sometimes signal noise, is something that this movie is a great example of, because it gives you a lot, it puts a lot out there, but it doesn't necessarily tell you, and if you take this, you go down this road, and if you take this, you go down this road. It's not on the rails like that. It's up to you what you take from it and what you came to it with. Obviously, someone who's never read Naked Lunch is going to take something very different from it. People who've read Naked Lunch, unfortunately, some of them, as we'll talk about in the nature of adaptation, might not like some of the things there because they might want it to be exactly that. It's not going to be like that. Some of them are influences or aspects of William Burroughs' life that have been melded and weaved into aspects of his fiction. In fact, more than Naked Lunch, some of the other books out there, obviously. Now, anyone who does think that, like, oh, there's all this hallucination and what does it mean, and was that really supposed to be like some sort of an alien creature, and what were they talking about with all that homosexuality? Anyone who really thinks that way, first of all, maybe this kind of movie isn't for you. That's got to be something initially that we say and consider, right? But I would say instead, if you want to consider yourself something intelligent and intellectual and capable of being cultured and developed, I would just say go and look up concepts like surrealism, like magic realism, and then try and think from those lenses about what this movie was like for you. And don't just take things either interpreting them literally or just interpreting them as if they're just fantasy, then that's just bullshit and nonsense and made up. And what was the answer anyway? I would say in general, if you want to enjoy movies, don't try and think what was the movie about in a sense of like there's an answer and you have to get to it like some sort of a standardized test. I'd say instead, find out what the answer is for you, or what you found enjoyable, or what your theory on it is, or what you took from a certain scene, whether it was there or not, whether some of it came from yourself. That to me is a more enjoyable way to enjoy art itself, and films particularly, because obviously they're like the prevalent visual medium of our day. Now, this movie to me is much more a David Cronenberg movie than it is in any way a William Burroughs book. Now, I don't mean that in the obvious, glib, literal manner that it is literally a David Cronenberg movie and not a William S. Burroughs book, but I mean in the sense that a lot more of it is coming from David Cronenberg's mind and his interpretation and his idea of how to meld Burroughs' life and his fiction together to come out with a movie that feels like a David Cronenberg movie, more so than it's trying to be overly faithful to the book and concepts in the book and put together a story from the book, which, remember, is famously a non-linear book. It's essentially just a lot of different things, some of them rambling, some of them short stories, some of them, it's not really a book, it's not really a novel in that particular sense. And so I think another thing I really appreciate about this movie is that I think it's one of the closest pieces of art that I've experienced to having some kind of a sense for what it's like to be within the psychedelic experience. Now, in general, I've found that from my own experience with psychedelics, that there are things in the world that you can identify which have a similar effect on you. And in certain areas, people talk about certain music as psychedelic, etc. But the problem is they tend to do that in a very simplified kind of like manner that tends to just mean things from the 60s that are very garish and simple colors and a bit hippy dippy in the lyrics. I think of psychedelia more as kind of thoughts that really shift your perspective or crack your paradigm of the world for a second or take you into another world and make you see it differently, even if just for a moment. Because just like the psychedelic experience, you might feel totally like that and think you're going to remember all these things, but maybe you don't once you come out of it again. Maybe you come out of that state and it's like coming out of a hot bath, you know, a few minutes later, yeah, you're thinking differently, you're feeling differently than you were when you were enjoying that warmth and being in that particular environment and having that relaxing effect on your mind. So I think this is a very psychedelic movie in that sense, especially some of the ideas contained within it. And also what I really like about it is something that it reminds me of in terms of the psychedelic experiences, those moments that you will get within it where you do kind of have almost like a second where it's not that you are sobered, because you're obviously very much under the effect of some kind of a substance. But I mean, obviously you can get in the psychedelic states without chemicals, by the way, guys. But it's those moments you get, those sudden points of clarity where you snap, and for a second you think to yourself either, oh, I'm in this state and I'd gone really far down a path there, and maybe my mind's eye had really taken over all that I was thinking and seeing, experiencing. Oh, and I'm back here again. Either it's like a rewinding of the clock, or you see something totally different, but in the sense of like, oh, wow, I'm in a totally different perspective. Wow, and this is entirely different. That's what this movie's like a lot of the time through it. I mean, obviously in some of the examples of where you see suddenly what he was seeing was drug hallucinations, and now you see what was there before, like a typewriter. In these sorts of scenarios, yeah, this is obviously a very jarring moment, and I can imagine for someone who doesn't have any experience with any of those concepts and wants a straightforward movie, this is kind of frustrating for them. I could see that. But then again, maybe this kind of a movie isn't for them, or maybe they're not going to appreciate it on that specific type of level, which doesn't mean they have to, but I think you will get more of it if you can. So one of the things I think is interesting about this movie is that I think it's a great example of the kind of adaptation and philosophy and process of adaptation that I want to exist, which is, I don't like the notion that an adaptation has to be faithful. I even hate that term in this context, faithful. The idea that, like, to be faithful, you have to be true to what it was, and you have to try and represent what it was in this way, and you have to keep the story the same and the characters. Oh, you can't change what a character was and what it meant and all these sorts of things. No, I think that's a huge flaw. I absolutely do not want adaptations to be faithful in that particular sense. Sometimes, sure, a book or a comic book can fit a movie pretty well as it was, with a lot of the aspects just taken over and used in similar fashion. But I've noticed that often tends to simply be the case that was a piece of art, like a book or a comic, which actually already had similar tropes or pacing or used similar styles as a movie would anyway. I mean, a great example of this, obviously, is probably one of the best comic book adaptations in terms of very faithful, but also very good in both mediums, is the movie Sin City. I think, what was that, 2003, by, isn't it like Robert Rodriguez or something? I forget his name anyway. The guy who did From Dusk Till Dawn, and obviously it's from the Frank Miller comic book. But if you ever read that comic book, that's a comic book that is very heavily influenced and inspired by film noir movies and crime movies. So it essentially comes from movies into the medium of comics and then goes back into movies. So it's not really that big a shock, is it, that there could be this direct connection and transposition in that sense. Now, there's a great Alan Moore principle that he's outlined, which is because people have often brought up the topic of the fact that he doesn't like movies made out of his comic books, and often asked him why he doesn't like them or why he doesn't think they're good. And he often makes the point that part of the whole point of him working in the medium of comics was to try and master and do things within the medium of comics, pages being turned that you look at one by one at a different speed, whatever speed you enjoy, with art shown in different aspects to catch the eye in certain ways and tell a certain visual story, different to a movie just shown at your eye at whatever, 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second, whatever it is, in constant fashion, that in theory in a cinema you can't just control and rewind and all these sorts of things. In that sense, his point was that he tried to do in the comic book medium things that only the comic book medium could do. So movies could not do these same things, could not tell the story the same way, could not create a character and an ambience the same way. And therefore, what is the point really in just trying to take those things over and put them into a movie? And I don't think it's a coincidence as a result that they've made a lot of Alan Moore movies, as in a lot of his comic books, into movies, and yet the majority of them have sucked, have been bad movies, even just as movies, and have been vastly inferior as pieces of art to the original comic book. And that's not just because I think it's impossible to make an adaptation. I mean, explaining here that I actually think the movie of Naked Lunch is probably better than the book. I'm not a huge fan of the book. I think it's all right. I think it has some interesting aspects. I think the movie's a fantastic piece of art, but very different, and that's what's crucial. Because, I mean, probably the best one of the Alan Moore ones, probably V for Vendetta, and even then, I don't really think that was in any way better. Like, a lot of the concepts, they bastardized in almost like, it's not even in an unnecessary manner, just in an uninteresting manner. And they actually took away some of the aspects that the spirit of the book had that was a lot more interesting, I thought. Some of it was a bit banal, even though it was a pretty decent movie. That one as a movie can stand, but not in comparison to the piece of art it's coming from. Part of my issue is this idea of it not being about recreating. Now, they'll use this term, recreating as a movie. The problem is, I don't want recreating to mean copying or just transposing qualities or aspects or characters or storylines. I want recreating to be more literal, like literally be creating it again, to be rethinking it, to be reimagining it. I mean, my ideal adaptation is a movie like Naked Lunch, where, yes, you've got some, in differing senses, brilliant source material and subject matter, but it's then interpreted. Parts of it are just thrown away that the artist doesn't want to use, taken down a different path entirely with invention and creativity applied by a different great artist with his own process, who then comes out with something that is very much his. It was someone else's. He took it, pushed it through the prism of himself and his artistic process and his creative approach, and it became something from him, a piece of art from him that has inspiration and ties, and was the spiritual successor to something that was a piece of art by someone else. That's what expression and art for me is about, and that's what this film's about. So I want it to be more like that, rather than this notion that films are supposed to adapt, or vice versa, the thing that they originally were and try and be faithful to, because I think that is inherently absurd.